Okay, so I think we have a decent number of people who have already joined, and probably maybe someone will join us also afterwards. I will kick off here another session of the DTX Estonia Digital Therapeutics Awareness Program. The goal is to spread the word on what are digital therapeutics, what is the opportunity, and boost the digital therapeutics ecosystem here in Estonia, so that we have more companies, more people, more knowledge about this space, and in the end we have a better healthcare system and thriving economy. So today we have Kevin Dean from Smart Health Science to talk about innovation management. Typically, it can be useful for many types of digital health companies, but especially for digital therapeutics companies, to know how to manage innovation, how to understand what are the unmet needs to tackle when starting and developing digital therapeutics company. So thank you so much, Kevin, for preparing this presentation for this group. The presentation will be recorded. Questions are, please post questions into the chat box, and I will share them to Kevin during the call, or just shout them out here. And yes, a quick introduction. So Kevin already knows a bit about healthcare, Estonian healthcare system. He's a very active mentor for the teams of Health Insurance Fund 90s project, sampler project program, and has a very strong background in healthcare and healthcare innovation from Royal Society of Medicine and Smart Health Science Limited, and has also experience in the Danish telehealth field, and done research in RAND Europe. So a lot of experience. I think Kevin can probably will share his background a little bit himself, and how he has come to this position to share about healthcare innovation and digital health innovation. So yes, I will now just give floor to Kevin, and let's begin.
Thank you very much, Preet, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you. What I'm going to take you through is some materials that I've developed over the last 10 years or so. As you can see here, I'm very old. I've been working in innovative technology for a very long time. Some of the lessons that I've learned that I'm going to try and explain and transfer to you today don't just happen in healthcare, they happen in all industries that I've worked in. And as you can see from this, the bullet point on this slide, it's quite a few. Currently, I run my own company, my advisory company, Smart Health Science. I'm the chair of one health tech company based in Finland, which is involved in imaging, MRI imaging, and the diagnosis of brain diseases, such as Alzheimer's disease, etc. I've recently stepped down as chair of a Swedish company involved in health tech. I'm work with RAND Europe, which does policy research into how many things can be better implemented, including health technology and technology more generally. My main time nowadays I spend with 3 venture capital investors, one based in London, in fact 2 of them based in London and the other in Stockholm. My history is largely in technology rather than biotechnology, but as I say, a lot of what I'm going to talk to you about today really applies in so many areas of industry, etc. But I have given it a healthcare twist for today. I use the word technology Danny Hillis once said, technology's definition is everything that doesn't work yet. So in other words, we call it technology when we notice it's working. So my definition is everything you notice working is technology. And healthcare historically has been incredibly slow to adopt new ways of working, new technologies, etc. So the word technology is almost a dirty word in the land of healthcare. So I often talk to three groups of people around this topic. One is entrepreneurs and inventors who are coming up with their own ideas to bring into the world of healthcare. And I'll divide that into health and care, because things that are involving medicine and therapies are slightly different from things which involve care, which can be social care, etc., for the elderly. But I've kind of conflated the two for this presentation today. I developed a lot of this material helping the Patient at Home program in Denmark from 2012 through to about 2017. If you don't know Patient at Home, I think there is still material online about Patient at Home. It was essentially about 35 projects and companies bringing new ideas to the telehealth market, organized through the Maersk Institute in South Denmark. And there are a lot of lessons learned from that. I'm going to talk about a lot of that today, but essentially I had to develop what you're about to see in order to help assess and advise 35 very different projects in the area of telehealth. I also talk to people who are going to invest in health tech, because they often don't understand and are quite frightened by some of the things they come across when they see health tech presentations, especially the risks, the liabilities, the regulatory issues that can come up, and some of the things to do with payback and when things are going to be paid for and who's even going to pay for them. And lastly, I advise people who are already invested in a company, either as an investor or a founder, in how they can progress the company, especially getting it to scale. That's really what I'm going to talk to you about today in the context of healthcare, especially telehealth, etc. Now, the good news is that inventions really do happen by chance very often. Brilliant people doing lots of different things come across an idea, and the post-it notes are an excellent idea of a glue that didn't work properly, and somebody repurposed it into a note that you can rip off and apply to many times and just keep a reminder. And in fact, if you look at Viagra, one of the blockbuster drugs of the last 30 years, it was invented as a blood pressure relief drug, and it didn't work very well for that at all, but as we all know, it had some quite interesting side effects. So inventions often happen by chance. Adoption is rarely by accident, though. People plan very, very carefully how to make inventions turn into everyday use, and that technology disappears and becomes something that's not very special. There's some good news and bad news. The good news, though, is that a lot of research has gone into innovation and how to take a simple invention and make it widespreadly adopted. There are a number of factors that you can think about that you can manage and anticipate. I'm not going to go through some of the very basics of putting a business plan together. I'm going to assume everybody knows how to put a business plan together and how to make it work. What I'm going to talk to you about are the gaps that I see as someone who receives probably 5 or 6 pitch decks, so proposals for investment. Every week I see 5 or 6 decks from people who think that they've got the best answer in the world for a specific problem, for a specific group of patients or a specific country. And usually they're flawed. Usually they have 1 or 2 flaws, often they have many more than that. But even people who think they are on top of this topic make big mistakes and errors. And even people who've been, had $20–30 million of funding plowed into their companies are still making these mistakes 10 years later. The bad news is, therefore, that innovation is complex, not complicated. A tank is complicated, a war is complex. So it's something where there's lots of moving parts, there's lots of things which aren't in your control, there are lots of things which can be influenced by public policy, by spending reviews, by strikes, by changes in ways of working, by pandemics, all of those things can come along and change things in terms of the adoption of healthcare technology. The other part is that most people think they understand how to manage their invention into the marketplace, and they don't really know how to do that. All the evidence I have from all those pitch decks, all those companies I've been involved with over the last 15, 20 years, there's a lot that we can all learn, and I'm certainly learning all the time. The issue is that people often don't think of innovation management as something which needs to be at the top of their CV. They think it's something that they can just get into as they go along. So long as they've got a good business plan, everything will come out all right. And I like this quotation from Simon Munnery. Many people are prepared to suffer for their art. Very few people are prepared to learn to draw. And actually studying how other people have made mistakes and how to get innovations into everyday use is so important. Even if you're a scientist with a brilliant idea, you really need to understand how to get this idea of yours into everyday use profitably so that it's sustainable, and that very rarely happens. We have a hit rate, something like 1 in 15 or 1 in 20 companies that starts up in the health tech industry actually survives and makes money. So the basics are, and this comes from general review of investment proposals that I get. The 3 common errors, and I'm not going to go into the detail of numbers that don't add up and optimistic hockey stick sales projections, things like that. Everybody does all of those things. The questions that most often come up when we hear people talking about their health tech inventions are to do with a strong commercial strategy first. Who will pay, why will they pay, and when will they pay is the most unanswered question that I come across when I see pitch decks. There's an assumption often that because the technology is good, because it's better than what is around at the moment, because it's something that a patient needs, or that we think a patient needs, or we think that a doctor needs, then it's going to be successful. The most important question is, who's going to pay, why are they going to pay, and when are they going to pay for this? Secondly, who's going to sell this? Is it something which you as a company need to build a whole business development and sales structure to be able to do that? Because that's really hard for a small company. And it's a much more subtle question than you might think of just saying, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to have a partnership deal with GE Healthcare or Siemens or whoever, and they'll do my work for me. They still need to have the answer to the question, who's going to pay, why, and when. And you also need to understand, if you've got a partnership, what's going to incentivize them to take this to market? What's going to incentivize their sales team to pitch your product, your service, your idea in front of everything else that they've got to talk about to their customers? One of the most difficult questions is, what or who is your competition? As you'll see in a minute, often the competition is very subtle and it's very cheap. It's one question which, if you've got questions on at the end of this, I'd be very happy to expand on more. And lastly, from a commercial strategy and investment, what we like to see is, what are the value inflection points? What are the stages of the development of your idea into a business, and that business from a very small scale into medium scale, etc.? What are the points at which you can say the material value of my company, my idea, has now changed? I've got some traction. I've got my first customer. I've got my pilot customer. I've now got my regulatory approval. I've got the first orders come in. I've fulfilled my first order. I've got a product roadmap, etc. Very rarely do we see those value inflection points set out in a way which is understandable, is being thought through, and that we as investors can see that if we put 2, 3, 4 million into a company at an early stage, at what point are we going to get that value back, and what multiple are we going to get that value back from? So thinking about value inflection points is often a missing part of a commercial strategy. And again, I'm very happy to talk more about that later in question time. Technology roadmap. This is something which most inventors, scientists, technical developers spend a lot of time on. And the one question, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time later talking about this, that they very rarely have thought through is, what exactly is the type of innovation that I've come up with, and how mature is it in its marketplace? I'll illustrate that with some real examples later. And especially for health tech, and in a moving world of regulatory requirements, with things like software as a medical device coming into everyday use now across the world, do you understand the costs and the time needed now and in the future for you to make sure that you are compliant with the regulatory requirements of the jurisdictions that you're going to sell into? The regulatory roadmap is frequently missing from pitch decks that I see, or it's just thrown away in passing, and actually can hide a lot of cost and time delays if not thoroughly understood. So those are just the basics. If you can answer all of those things adequately, you'll get investors to pick up their ears, and you'll be credible, and then we can look at, well, okay, how good an invention is it? What kind of market is it, et cetera, et cetera. Now, these real world results, on the right-hand side of this, you can see something that I've shared with, I think, all 4 of the telehealth projects that I've been supporting with mentoring for the last 2 years or so, 2.5 years in Estonia. These are just an excerpt, these 4 parts of a paper I wrote at the end of Patient at Home, which were, I think, the 8 or 9 common themes across all 35 projects in Patient at Home, which occurred time and time again, not on every single project, but every one of the projects had at least 1 or more of these issues. And I've summarized them onto this slide for you. I am very happy. It's a public domain document that I published. If anybody's interested in that, if you let me know through the DTX organizers, I'll provide a copy of that summary of the feedback from Patient at Home. But in summary, many ideas don't have good value propositions. Now, what's a value proposition? I'll come on to that in a bit more detail later, but it's the what's in it for the stakeholders, and understanding the stakeholders, articulating very well what's in it for them. The most frequent mistake that people make is to build their value propositions around what I call soft benefits. So if you implement my IT system, you will need not to hire another 50 nurses in 3 years' time. If we've got anybody from a payer organization on the session today, they will know that actually they need hard benefits. They need to understand how many fewer nurses, or how many fewer doctors, or how many fewer drugs are we going to be making? What material differences are we going to make to our budget? Not money that I might have not spent in the future that I might not spend anyway. It's a very soft benefit, and that's usually the thing that pollutes most value propositions. The other is focusing on just one stakeholder. There are 3 stakeholders that each have to have a value proposition very strongly in their favor, and I'll come back to that later in the presentation. The second one is your brilliant new idea just uncovering demand that's been unrecognized so far in the healthcare system? Or is it going to create demand that's never been there before because you've got a new treatment for a disease that hasn't been treatable before? They're not quite the same issue. But if you're a policymaker, if you're a payer, if you're managing the insurance scheme or the taxpayer, if you're in the NHS, for instance, here in the UK, one of the last things you want is to be presented with an entirely new branch of demand, or uncover unrecognized demand which no one has budgeted for. Now, it doesn't mean to say it won't get dealt with, but typically money's got to be taken from somewhere else and redeployed into that new area. And that's a massive decision for policymakers and for financial managers to do. So even if you haven't even thought through whether you're creating demand or uncovering unrecognized demand, you're in a difficult place when you come to start selling your idea into the healthcare system. And certainly as investors, we look at this very, very closely, because if actually there's got to be a massive relocation of funding in order to be able to pay for this new treatment or this new service, that can take a long time, and it's not guaranteed. A lot of products need a service wrapper around them, and I have an excellent example which I'll give you later, of a telehealth tool which was brilliant technically, but needed so much reorganization of the processes in the hospital in order to be able to use it. that it was failing. And when they put a simple service wrapper around it, so a nurse needed to make one phone call and organize that product to be delivered to the patient, it then took off and was very successful. Probably the most difficult topic is displacing costs and benefits by time and organization. So this is the situation where I invent a new product, doesn't matter what it is, that's given to patients outside of a hospital, that needs to be prescribed through, say, general practice, the primary care route. And the people who will benefit from that are the patient, but the patient will benefit in 20, 30 years' time when they don't have a heart attack suddenly and drop dead. And the emergency department and the theatre department and the cardiology department in the hospital in 20, 30 years' time, because they have less demand. And what we've done there is we've put cost and authority of a decision to prescribe something today into one organization, and the benefits are somewhere else and somewhere else in time. And that makes it really difficult to make decisions to acquire new technologies. It's not always that difficult, and there are organizations certainly developing now, integrated care organizations, etc. Some insurance companies and insurers are very sophisticated in how they look at this, but a lot aren't, and a lot aren't in many, many jurisdictions. So displacing costs and benefits by time and organization causes you real headaches when you're trying to say who will pay and when will they pay, because it's very difficult to put a name on the customer who's going to make the decision to sign up for your product. Slightly less frequently, a lot of things in the last 10 years have claimed to be patient-driven. They're patient-centric, they're patient-focused, the patient really love this. And actually, when you look at the technology and how they've been applied, they're clinician-driven. So they're designed around somebody who's got more medical knowledge, who's got more familiarity with instruments, more familiarity with technology, et cetera, and they're not really patient-driven at all. In the patient at home program, I think we probably ended up with just 3 or 4 truly patient-driven projects, whereas a lot of them claim to be patient-driven. Mass customization is often needed in healthcare. That's because we're all different sizes, shapes, psychologies, states of mind, whether if it's mental illness, we're very subtly different in many, many different ways. And mass customization is an engineering method of saying I can make something that's very standardized, but it will fit everybody. So often, when that might be in the process that's used, the profile, it might be a physical design, this isn't taken into account enough in healthcare by healthcare technology developers. How do I build in mass customization early so that I can get a bigger possible population of patients are going to be suited to using my product or service without me having to put cost into customize for every individual patient. Another big one, competition. The competition is often do nothing, or it's very low cost. I worked many years ago now with a company that invented an incredibly sophisticated portable IV, intravenous fluids injection pack, so that patients could wander around the hospital much, unencumbered, with basically what's a shoulder bag and an IV drip into their arm. It was all computer controlled, it was battery powered, etc. The competition was a metal stick with 3 wheels on the bottom of it and an IV bag. And most hospitals actually are designed to have either lifts or flat corridors where it's not that much of a problem to just move your metal pole with your IV bag on the top of it. And they're very cheap, they're very reliable, and they've been around for 40, 50 years. Needless to say, the sophisticated battery-powered, GPS-connected, I think, as well, device for delivering intravenous fluids didn't do very well because it was incredibly expensive compared with the £20 or $20 it cost to make a metal stick with some wheels on the bottom. Process changes are frequently required. If you go into, say, a hospital and look at the nursing stations, they're often very packed, sometimes with lots of paperwork on the desks. They'll have several telephones there. They'll have radios as well. They'll have several screens for different IT systems that they access. They probably have some medicines and bandaging and things like that that has been in use and are about to go somewhere. They'll have some chairs around. If you want to introduce a new process into that environment, you have to really think very carefully about how it's going to work with everything that's there already. And just introducing a new screen or a new device, or even a new screen where I have to Alt-Tab to toggle between two screens, is a big change in process for nurses, and especially if they have to do a separate sign-on, etc., etc. So process change that's required to adopt new ways of working, often thought about last rather than first. If you need to add a process wrapper around your product, think very early about how those process changes are going to be accommodated into the working environment of the people that are going to use it. Lastly, one of the biggest problems, and I worked with an airline probably 20 years ago now, and we were eradicating call centers across the airline's staff service. So airlines have a lot of cabin crew, flight crew moving around the world. They needed a lot of help, and historically they'd had call centers. We introduced an entirely mobile online capabilities for the crew to manage their own lives. It was terrific. The issue was, until we got over 85% of the crew using over 85% of the technology, we couldn't switch off the call centers around the world. So what we'd actually done is introduce lots of extra costs in these new computers and IT software and overheads, etc., etc. And until we got 85% and 85% adoption, we couldn't even think about cutting the costs. So tipping points for adoption are something you need to think about very carefully. At what point will the healthcare system be happy to shut down the old way of supporting patients or minimalize it and only use your new technology method to support patients? Usually it's quite a high proportion, it's a high degree of confidence. And that's one of the reasons that telehealth, telecare has been very slow to be adopted, is that unless you understand those tipping points, what you're actually doing is creating extra costs for the healthcare system. You're not saving anybody anything. And healthcare systems usually are very tight on funds, and they're very tight on funds to enable change. So those are things that came out of the real world review of Patient at Home, actually, across 35 projects, not just in Denmark, but in other countries as well. My response was to give the innovators a checklist. I'm going to go through some of these. This is part of the intellectual capital that I license to organizations when they're either investing or moving from being an idea on paper to a real company. I'm not going to cover all of these today. I'm just going to cover 3 or 4 of them. Ones which I think are particularly interesting in the context of what I've seen in Estonia. Mission critical or peripheral activity, what kind of innovation, how mature is it? This idea of cost and benefit displacement I briefly talked about, and the overlapping interests of the critical stakeholders in making someone successful. The others are just as important, but I don't have time today to talk about all of them. And when you look at all of those together, you come up with something I call the overall business model shift. And I'll talk to you about that later, but that's really partly related to this tipping point idea. Just how significant a change in the healthcare provision model, in the processes, the staffing, the technology, how big a deal is it for the provider organization that you're working with and the payer that's paying for it to adopt with what you're trying to sell them? I'll come back to the subtleties of this later, but it's a really important topic that you need to understand if you're going to be successful. And I'll iterate again, I'm not really going to talk too much more about value offered, but having a value proposition, understanding it, and understanding for the investor when those value inflection points are going to come around is really important. And I don't see that talked about anything like enough in investment requests. So let's have a look at mission critical activity. Something that's mission critical impacts fundamental processes. It's really important. It's usually, if I'm going to tackle this and change the way it's handled, perhaps using new technology. So say, for instance, going to telehealth and telemonitoring and switching off the telephone calls to specialists and just going through Zoom, for instance. Some of the changes that we had to make, for instance, certainly in the NHS, I suspect it happened in Estonia as well, with the advent of the pandemic in 2020. Suddenly it wasn't safe, we thought, to go to GP surgeries, certainly for very vulnerable people, and Zoom consultations came about. Now, I would say that's a very high risk, fundamental change in process, got an immediate impact because it changes the way people's works. It's got very high visibility and brand importance because suddenly people were kind of saying, I can't go and see my doctor anymore. I've got to use this technology. I don't have good internet connection. I don't have a big enough screen. I don't have the right phone, all those kind of things. Very important. Huge cost implications, massive change in where funds is going to be deployed. It can have competitiveness implications if it's impacting a fundamental process, if competition is important. And it's something that you might not be able to deliver by yourself. You might actually have to work with specialist organizations that know about the technology or mobile technology or computing technology or backups or cloud technology. You're suddenly into a big process change. Now, peripheral process, so let's take a world that we all understand. A fundamental process for, say, a car manufacturer might be the design process for their cars and especially their car engines, etc. A peripheral process for a car manufacturer is making the wheels of the cars. Typically, that's outsourced to someone else entirely. If you're in an organization, for instance, like, I don't know, a big organization like an IBM, etc., big tech organization, then your own technology, the manufacturing of that technology, perhaps the design, etc., the systems engineering, that's a fundamental process. It's mission critical. Peripheral processes are banking and payroll, and managing expenses, and managing travel, and managing credit cards for salespeople on the road. Those are all peripheral processes. Now, one of the big mistakes that people make when they look at a healthcare organization, healthcare provider, and the patient's relationship is to misunderstand what's mission critical and what's peripheral. And this varies sometimes by jurisdiction based on how people are paid. So, for instance, at the outset of the pandemic, I was working with a company that worked really very hard on a telehealth capability for American primary care doctors to monitor vulnerable patients to see if they were going down with COVID-19. And if they had COVID-19, whether they were tracking well with it. Now, unfortunately, there was no reimbursement at the time for American doctors to be involved in anything like that, to look at the prevention side of COVID-19. And so that entire program was completely peripheral to the customer that it was trying to be sold to. It had traction in other parts of the world where integrated care or a view of the patient over a longer period of time without specific paid incentives was important. At the end of the day, in some parts of the world, it's actually better for a doctor that you get ill, you come into hospital and you have a very expensive operation rather than preventing going into hospital in the first place. Now, this is changing, but really understanding what's mission critical and peripheral processes for your customer and making sure that you're pitching in the right way, you're putting the right metrics in front of them, you're understanding the value case, can turn something which is peripheral into a fundamental process, but you have to work at it very, very hard. Now, it's often very difficult to give specific examples without talking about very confidential information. But think about this very, very hard when you're looking at how am I going to sell, who am I selling to, and make sure you're not selling what's in effect a peripheral process when you could make it a mission critical activity. Next one is what type of innovation. I took a picture of my, so you can tell how old this is because I had an iPod on my desk at the time. Although it's, I think I've got a BlackBerry there maybe even as well or something like that. It's probably at least 12, 15 years old. No, I think it's 12 years old. One of the first iPads came out in 2011. And my challenge at the time, and I'm not going to practice with you guys today, was to ask the audience. There's a DVD there. There's a cup and saucer that's a very fancy one with a London Underground map and an Underground logo on it. There's one of the first Apple mice there, a nice Apple device at the back there running Google, and iTunes running on an iPad. How many different kinds of, and actually hiding behind there is a solid state disk drive as well, or actually a backup disk drive. How many different kinds of innovation are there on that desk? And the answer is actually all of them, because you can, as I give you these as well. There's so much a product based. So there's a product based there. Would be a calculator. You can see the calculator there, or even an iPad perhaps could be product based. Service based is iTunes, because iTunes is a fantastic example of a service based proposition, where basically I don't physically get anything. I don't really have a product. I get a service, which is music on demand, and I can subscribe to that, and I can get any music. It could be Skype as a video conference service, or Zoom, or whatever that we're using now. Adding features is the next thing. So can I take an existing product and add features to it? So I take an iPad and then I can add apps to it, and I add features every time I add an app to it. That's probably the most direct example here. Infrastructural innovation is one you can't see there, but it's the Wi-Fi and the broadband that's connecting my office to the internet and to the rest of the world. Actually, broadband connection is pretty useless unless you have something to plug it into, and you have a browser and you have other services attached to it. So infrastructure is an interesting type of innovation which we need to come back to, because infrastructural innovations come up frequently in healthcare, and they're not always as easy to identify as broadband or the rail network or the road network, which are all infrastructural innovations. Integrated innovations, I'll come back to later, but an integrated innovation, a good example is an iPad, because it's actually lots of things coming together. Application shift is the DVD. Started out as a CD and then became a DVD, the digital versatile disc. Goes from holding some music to holding MP3 files to holding video files, and then we know it can be used for backups and other things now. But that's shifting applications. Enhanced products and services, that's my pink, actually my daughter's pink, we call it, it's not Walkman, is it? Whatever it was, iPod, because it's an enhanced product, because my first one and my second one, my third one were all white. And then suddenly the multicolored iPods came out, and sales were, all sorts of different markets opened up for them. And then there's process innovations. Process innovations are some of the hardest, because it's very difficult, very, very difficult to patent a process. It's very difficult to protect the IP around a process. It is possible in some circumstances, but generally process innovations are really difficult to hold on to, because they can be replicated so easily in different contexts. Process innovations on this desk, there are many examples there. You can combine these together. The example I gave earlier is a good example of a combination, where I had a product-based innovation. It was in effect a suitcase for looking after COPD patients at a distance. It had video communications, a spirometer, a pulse oximeter, and it was connected over Wi-Fi or broadband back to the hospital, the pulmonary department in the hospital, for remote monitoring of COPD patients after they've left hospital. But how does the suitcase get to the patient at the right time when they're being discharged today? And how do we know that the patient's got a broadband connection? And how does the patient know what to do when they get the suitcase when it arrives, perhaps 2 or 3 days later? What I really want is the suitcase to be waiting for my patient at their home when they're discharged, and then have a training session all set up for them, scheduled for the hardware and the equipment, and then also have booked in the patient's first consultation with a nurse. And that's a lot of process change, a lot of admin for a hospital department to put in place just when they're discharging a patient, and it can create long delays. The service innovation was a phone number that the nurse called when they were ready to discharge the patient, And the company then provided the provision service of making sure that the device was delivered to the patient's home, it was connected, and a training session was given before the first call was made by the nurse. Transformational. It's a service wrapper around. Sometimes those service wrappers might not be call centers or training sessions or something which is easy to deliver. It might be a financial product. Lots of industries I've worked in have had to put financial products around their product a wrapper around their product in order to make them accessible, affordable. The business case might be great, but if I need to put in £3 million up front that I don't have in my capital budget, I'm not going to adopt this new invention. If you can make it so that I can pay for that 3 million over the next 3 million customers, I'm really happy to do that because it's a pound or a dollar or a euro per customer. So thinking about service innovations wrapping around products, not always a call center or making something easy. It might actually be a financial product wrapped around it. And there are lots and lots of different examples of how innovation types can be combined. One of the lessons that I've learned on innovation types is that you also need to look at maturity of the innovation. I'm using two extreme examples here. Innovative bread. It's a different shape and it's got some more seeds or some lemon zest in it. Bread's at the top of its maturity curve, frankly. It's been around for thousands of years. We all know how to make bread. In the pandemic, lots of people started making it in their own homes, and they sprinkled chia seeds or sesame seeds over the top, and they innovated their bread every day. So it's a highly mature, and the differences in competition are really very slight, and the subtleties of the product difference between each product very slight. We look at genomics and the use of genomic medicine. It's still at the very, very early stage of innovation maturity. We're just starting to see the tip of the iceberg of what's possible with genomics. It's a very different stage of maturity. Now, depending where you are on this maturity curve can affect what you have to do to get your product into the market. And understanding what your competition's maturity is really important as well. So, for instance, if you come up with a new way of assessing metabolic health, your competition is a tape measure and a pair of weighing scales, because everybody uses BMI, body mass index, to assess someone's metabolic health. It's an absolutely useless biomarker, BMI, for the individual, because there are many other things which determine your metabolic health, and BMI is just a general. It's pretty good at population level though. So if you're doing population risk assessment, BMI is pretty good. When I look at Brit or myself, we're actually got very different body types, Brit and myself, but our risks are very different. I know I've actually got very low visceral fat, which is the dangerous stuff. I might have a bit more around my waist, but I have very low visceral fat. Brit, I don't know Brit's body composition, but he could be very tall and slim, but have 4 pounds of fat around his heart and liver, and actually be in a very dire state from a metabolic point of view. So if your competition is highly mature, it's like very cheap, it's everywhere, it's adopted by everybody, and I come along with something which requires an MRI scan. How do you think that's going to go? Well, there's something much better, but it's going to take you 10, 15 years to establish exactly what subgroup of patients in what kind of disease state is it going to be useful for. We're not going to replace a tape measure and weighing scales with an MRI scan overnight for every single member of the population. Now, I've used an extreme example there, but looking at innovation maturity and the kind of innovation, what's the maturity of your competition, is absolutely fundamental, deciding how and when you're going to invest in the product, what you're going to target as the target market, sub-market, and how you're going to create that value proposition. These two things, I can't stress to you how often I go to companies and they have no thinking at all about the maturity of their innovation and what kind of innovation it is, and therefore what their competition is and what they will have to do to move up this maturity curve and gain market share. Here's one I talked about briefly earlier. And it is all over health and care, especially health tech adoption. What and when is going to be the benefit for whom? And who is really going to benefit? Is it going to be the people who are paying for the invention and the innovation right now? Is it going to be a different organization in 3 or 4, and in political terms, 3 or 4 parliaments' time? If it's 30-year benefit from this new pill, which will delay the onset of Alzheimer's, but it costs £100 a week for every citizen, it's going to be a brave government that's going to take those tax decisions now, even if it delays things for 30 years' time. Because that, frankly, there'll be 5 different parliaments by the time the benefit starts to come through. And that benefit often, by the way, isn't guaranteed. So looking at your innovation, what you're bringing to market, and saying, who is it going to benefit? Who's going to buy this? Are they going to benefit? And what's the feedback loop that they're going to get? Similarly, with a patient as well, I often talk, and I've talked to Prit and others in the telehealth programs in Estonia about tight feedback loops. Where's the benefit? Where's the cost? When do I see that benefit? Is it me that sees the benefit, or is it someone else? These things are absolutely fundamental to creating good business cases, good value propositions for health tech. Understanding who am I going to sell to, who's going to buy it, where's the benefit going to land, and when's the benefit going to land, and trying to find ways of tightening those loops up so that the person who pays, or the organization who pays, benefits and sees benefits of some kind in time for them to make a good decision. And it's not going to be someone else in 30 years' time who's actually going to benefit from that decision. So the last of these I'm going to go through, and there are several others, is an insight that was given to me by a German doctor that I used to work with. Germany is an interesting marketplace for healthcare. I think it's more close to the US model, which is around payment for activities which are very specified for reimbursement. Most German doctors I've talked to, if you say, I've got something new here, they'll say, well, why would I adopt it? What's in it for me? Is it something that's going to help me? It's certainly going to help my patients. I'm taking the Hippocratic Oath out of this entirely. Doctors very rarely do things which don't help their patients. But if you look at it and say, meets my quality requirements, meets my safety requirements, where are the financial benefits to me? The 3 overlapping interests, though, are not just the professionals, the doctors and nurses. It's the patient as well has to benefit, and the payer organization or the provider organization. All 3 of them have to have overlapping interests. All my experiences, if it's great for the patient, but it's expensive for the provider organization and it's difficult for the doctor to adopt, it won't get adopted. If it's great for the patient, it's great for the provider, but it's really hard for the doctor and nurse to change their working processes, everything they've ever learned, and learn new skills, it's going to be very slow to be adopted. If it's great for the doctor or nurse and it's great for the patient, but it's extremely expensive and doesn't have a great business case, no matter how hard you do, that provider, that payer is going to find it very difficult to justify moving funds from one usage to the new one, because the business case is so hard. So as you go into value propositions, what's a perfect value proposition is something that's great for the patient, simultaneously great for the nurse or the doctor, and great for the provider and the payer. When you have all 3 overlap, then great things can happen. If it's 1 out of 3, very unlikely. 2 out of 3, much harder. And actually looking at quality, safety, and financial factors simultaneously across patient, professional, and provider organization, or payer organization, is really important. Again, very, very rarely do I see explained in a pitch deck or in a business plan how these things are being addressed by the company. So let's look at overall business model shift. A business model shift which is low might sound like it's a really good thing. You do things a little bit better, a little bit faster, and a little bit cheaper. Yep, that can be okay, but it often doesn't actually change anything. It might have 5–10% impact on costs, it often drops into that. This is a peripheral activity, because it's not fundamentally changing the economics, it's not fundamentally changing the quality of care, it's not fundamentally changing the efficiency of delivery of care. If it's very, very high, the business model shift that's required. So high business model shift might be, I've got to retrain every nurse and doctor in the country. I've got to equip everybody with a latest generation iPhone and keep the software up to date. I've got to give every patient a device, and I've got to make sure that device has batteries or a power supply or a Bluetooth signal or a Wi-Fi signal. And I've got to check that at least every hour of every day, because I'm now shifted a mission critical process onto that patient connection. And I can't afford for the patient to be out of touch with the doctors and nurses. So that's that's a very high business model shift. So low business model shift has low impact, high business model shift has high risk. What you're looking for in assessing where your business model shift is, if it's very, very low, well, how can I make it more mission critical? How can I make it more important to be adopted? How can I make it more significant, have more impact on the healthcare system, on the payer, the provider, the clinician, the patient? If you're at the very, very high end, I need everything in the healthcare system to change before my product will be adopted. You need to say, well, okay, that's never going to happen. How do I back that off? How do I choose a patient cohort or a professional cohort or a use case or a region or a country that has the right incentives in place already? They're already doing integrated care, for instance, integrated care planning and financing. How do I get that? So lower the business model shift that's required to get this going. Quite a complicated subject. In my toolkit that I have for my clients, we have a way of calculating, at least putting a relative number on business model shift. It's very subjective, but for you, just think about this, because if you've got too low a business model shift, the danger is people will ignore what you're doing. It's too high, people will be so scared of adopting it because they don't want to change everything in the tax system, the healthcare system, the nurses training, patients' homes, the risk that people are taking that they won't adopt it. That just summarizes that. Showing value. Often people ask me, how do I create a good value proposition? There are really just 5 categories that you need to look at. Speed. Can I do something faster? Can I solve this problem faster? Can I react to the patient's problem faster? Can I make sure that the clinician is available sooner? Quality, and that's around safety, relative quality, absolute quality. Am I improving the quality of care? Am I improving quality of life, etc.? And organizations like NICE, the National Institute for Clinical Excellence here in the UK, have very sophisticated algorithms to look at something called quality adjusted life years, to say, is this quality of care, this quality of life of value to the healthcare system? Cost, and there are lots of things in cost. As I said, there are soft benefits, hard benefits. Cost avoidance, for instance, you won't need to hire more people in the future, as many people as you thought you were going to hire, often quite soft. Whereas saying, here's a definite increase in productivity, which will deliver hard benefits, is a much more easy business case to make. I have 2 or maybe 3 really good reports that were done in Nottinghamshire, in the Nottingham University Hospitals, by the ACCA, which is the Association of Certified Chartered Accountants at the European level, and it was sponsored by the European Commission. About 10 years old now, but those 3 reports, and I've provided them, I think, to all of the projects I've been working with on the Estonian telehealth projects. Those reports by the ACCA are really good examples of how to do cost accounting for projects to show the benefits. And again, if anybody's interested in those, I can point you towards where you can find those online. And capacity and convenience also go into showing value. Having a good value proposition for the customer, for the patient, for the clinician, the professional, and for the payer provider organization is really important. Now, the challenges that we face in healthcare, they're huge. And everybody would think, looking at this list, which I'm not going to go through now, would mean that constantly everybody is looking for better patient safety, better care quality, it must get better. Application of technology especially is going to help with all of this. So you'd think that we need a high business model shift, and yet everything about the healthcare system is such that it really doesn't like high business model shifts. Now, I've worked with a very venerable clinician and policymaker over here in England. He's worked with the NHS for, I think, over 50 years. And he's seen something like 42 major reorganizations of the NHS over those 42 years. So every couple of years, there's a huge so the whole organization changes, and then it goes for 2 years and then it changes again. Typically financing and management authorities and things like that. You could say they're high business model shifts, but actually what happens between the patient and the clinician, whether it's in primary care, secondary care, etc., is a very much slow evolutionary process. And it's very, very cautious because of the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm, and because people are very, very cautious about making big changes where patients' lives are possibly at risk. One of the common themes about all of these is the time it's taken to get these innovations into healthcare. And it's something which is very, you should be very sanguine about when you look at what you're doing in healthcare and how long it took the stethoscope to be adopted, for instance. You may not know this, but I've heard various numbers about periods of time about this. I think it's at least 30 years from the invention of the stethoscope to it being widely adopted and used by doctors. You'd think that was such an obvious invention that people would just start using it. No, it took a long time. Arguably, hand washing, I think, was first uncovered in the 1700s. The guy who uncovered hand washing as one of the main preventive actions for infections was hounded out of his profession and died in poverty because everybody else thought you just had to open the windows and let the miasma out of the hospital wards. And even today we have in the UK, I don't know what it's like in Estonia, every hospital ward has reminders to patients and clinicians to wash their hands as they enter and exit the ward. And that was before COVID. And I could go through the rest of these. These are all very, very, very slow moving innovations. And there's a lot of other factors which mean adoption is slow. This, I think, comes from a Department of Health in the UK study a long time ago. Well, actually, probably about 10, 15 years ago. And all of these things mean that having a good plan which addresses those 10 plus business model shift factors that I've talked to you about today will make your innovation much more likely to be adopted. Diffusion planning is something which is really important. So actually, of all the things which you can do to try and accelerate the adoption of your technology, factor 7 and factor 9, the interest overlap, what's in it for the provider, payer, the professionals and the patient. If you get that right, that helps a lot. If you can have a business case which doesn't displace benefits and costs in time and organization, that helps a lot. I would say the other thing which is really, really important is strong human networks. If you can get good advocates, KPIs, some people who are going to influence the adoption. In England, it's the Royal Colleges, it's often key individuals who lead their professions. If you can get endorsement from that with good evidence behind it, then you're much more likely to get fast diffusion. One of the most successful innovations that I've worked on worked really well in one hospital. Typically, hospitals are in competition with each other intellectually, and hospitals don't often like borrowing ideas from other hospitals. I don't know if you have that in Estonia. It's certainly something which is a feature in many health economies. But in this case, The hospital that first adopted the technology went out of their way to say to everybody else, come and see us, come and visit us, we'll hold seminars, we'll tell you, because we think the benefits are so great, everybody should be helping with that. And the word got out through the human networks and through those influential networks. And today there are 42 hospitals using that technology, almost without, through competitive procurement, but without question, one of the most rapid rollouts of technology I've seen in a single health economy. And that was through human networks. The benefits that are relevant to your customer, I've talked about this a little bit, which is understand what your customer really needs. Often nowadays, hard cash, real budget savings are what people are looking for, not soft savings. The demand question comes up. Very few payers are going to thank you for uncovering unrecognized demand and actually generating new demand because you've solved a problem that nobody knew existed before. Uncovering new treatments for widely held diseases which have long. So, for instance, I think the DMDs, the disease-modifying drugs which are coming to the market for Alzheimer's disease, they're $20, $30, $40, $60,000 per session. Really quite difficult, especially if the more developed drugs in 5-10 years time have to be taken from the age of 30 onwards by everybody who's at risk. You can imagine that's a completely different scenario. So uncovering demand, which nobody, we didn't even have, I don't even have Alzheimer's, and yet I'm going to have to start taking a prophylactic pill to ward it off. That's a very difficult commercial decision for a government or an insurance company to take. So uncovering demand is really difficult. Safety and quality are usually things which are concentrated on very hard, and you miss out on the kind of savings and whether you're uncovering demand. This deck, which I can share with you, also covers the kinds of value proposition, the elements of value proposition, and whether they're cash avoiding, cash releasing, whether they're immediate or they take a long term to come out. All of these factors can be put together into a very effective business case. So to summarize, you need to get the basics right. Have you got a strong commercial strategy, and can you answer these questions and the subtleties of the material that I just talked to you about? In your technology roadmap, do you really understand what kind of innovation you've got, how it needs to be perhaps combined with a service wrapper around it, and especially what's the competition and what's the maturity of the competition? Because the biggest competition is often do nothing, or let's keep using the very low cost solution that we've had for the last 30 years. And from a regulatory point of view, and if software is involved in your product and going into the future, making sure you understand the regulatory roadmap you're going to go through, software as a medical device especially, is really, really important. So I've talked about a lot of subtleties behind this, but these are the basics that need to be put in place. There's a reminder of the checklist. 10 things. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Really good insights, and definitely something that everyone needs to think about before, everyone needs to think about those things when starting, but also when being on the way, even if the technology is mature, but quite often digital health companies are going through different types of pivots and treatment, product adjustments. So this is something to revisit every once in a while to make sure that that you're not falling off the path. I have a number of questions here, but maybe to start with, so how to actually balance between the high business model and change and low business model change approaches, while also trying to get the investment. So meaning that your change might be a very big one, or you don't know, but you have quite many reasons to believe that. And then it will be a big change. It will but it probably will take a lot of time. So what is your kind of tips to, or like from your investor perspective, or how you consult investors in this area to keep an eye on? So in the end, like 30 years is to be long of a horizon for investors.
It's a perennial question. If it's a high business model shift, I'm just going to find you the definitions of high business model shift. If it's a high business model shift, the real trick, and if I described, the case of looking at metabolic health, and the competition is weighing scales and a tape measure and a color-charted table that you can find on Google, and the new innovation involves an MRI scan. That's a really good example. Find the high value niche. So find the medical procedure, find the disease, find the patient cohort, find the medical specialty where this is really important that you can get traction. If I was looking at, say, in that context, gastric surgery is highly invasive, very expensive, and might be carried out on people who are clinically obese, morbidly obese, but actually at very low risk because of where the fat that they're depositing is being held. So in that case, if it's a surgical intervention, then perhaps it justifies having an MRI scan. Do you see what I'm saying? So when you've got very high business model shift, finding a really rock solid business case, which has a very strong value proposition for those three, for the patient, for the clinician, and for the provider payer. That's the way to go down there. What you've then got to do is show the investors that you've not just got one trick up your sleeve, which is that one application that you can get from there into an adjacent application, and you can move on. If you have a very low business model shift, my first question is always, well, why are you doing this in the first place? It's what I call the sharper scalpel scenario. I actually dealt with a company once that said they had a scalpel that was 10% sharper than somebody else's scalpel. And I just went, well, so what? The scalpels we've got already are sharp enough. Why are you spending so much time on a sharper scalpel? And there was one or two surgical cases where a sharper scalpel might have been useful, but it really wasn't. Well, so what? What you're really looking to do if you've got low business model shift is to say, have I really thought through the implications of this? Is there a scenario? Is there a process? Is there a segment of the market where actually this isn't peripheral activity, it's mission critical activity to change this? But generally, low business model shift is much more difficult to deal with than high business model shift.
Okay, yeah, I think this is a good example, and maybe also doing a little bit of both, and having the low business model shift to as a learning way to learn on the market, and then the higher shift is the actual end product.
A good example. A long time ago, kits were produced for some operations where everything you needed for the operation was in a sealed plastic bag, sterilized plastic bag, and they were shipped out to every patient who's having a particular operation. And it was costing a lot of money. When someone actually went and looked at how the theatre used that kit, most of the things that were in the kit were already in the theatre, in the operating theatre, in other guises. They're from different sources, or they were just loose in the, they're in the general equipment. So what was happening? The nurse was tearing open the bag, taking out the one thing they needed and throwing the rest away. So the business model shift there was to actually sell the item that was really necessary for a slightly higher price, do away with all the cost and waste of the rest of the items, the disposable items in the bag, and simply improve the logistics service around, the wrapper around the piece that was actually needed, the product that was actually needed, and make sure that it was in good supply to the laboratory, to the theatres. So actually, that was a low business model shift, which moved to a high business model shift because they just changed the product by putting a service wrapper around it.
I have a few questions that I've been directed to directly, and then and Siim also has his hand up. So first of all, peer therapeutics is something that we have discussed, and the digital health community, at least one channel what I follow, kind of said that, okay, peer therapeutics didn't do anything wrong, but it just kind of like they did everything right, but still healthcare is hard. Do you have any comments on that use case? I think this is a good learning use case for digital therapeutics, and like against which of those theses or suggestions what you have listed they kind of failed at.
I don't like to directly comment, especially when I don't have the real insights into an organization. What I saw from a distance, they failed on several. I would just say they failed on several of my 10 points, and the most common with telehealth, telehealth in particular, is falling into the trap of thinking that even today, prevention and new models of care are mission critical to organizations. There are very few organizations nowadays that have their financial model set up for telehealth to really and especially prevention models to really flourish. This displacement in organization and time of cost and benefit is a real killer. It really is very difficult to do. The incentives, the overlapping interests. So if I'll find my 10 items. The overlapping interests, number 9, is often ignored as well, and I think that probably wasn't paid enough attention to. But I don't have enough insight into the details. The difficulty with any business is as it evolves. What's really, really important from this list of 10, and plus the business model shift at the beginning, is the emphasis is slightly different later on. So, for instance, if you don't, I didn't go into it, but high flow or customized business type. If you don't understand that, if you don't understand what kind of innovation you've got at the beginning, you generally don't get very far. You can ignore the human networks, you can ignore the overlapping interests for quite a long time, until the point at which you actually have to sell and you move from project mode into what I call operational mode. One of the sad things about many telehealth projects is that they remain projects. So everybody agrees that we need a better way of dealing with, with dermatology at a distance. We need a better way of diagnosing and monitoring skin diseases. Everybody agrees that should happen. And there's a new technology comes out. Yeah, everybody agrees with that. And we put some project money aside for that, and it really works. And then the project money comes to an end, and everybody kind of goes, well, who's going to pay for this now? Are we all happy to pay for this new model? Because isn't it an extra cost that we have to, because we haven't got to the tipping point where we can switch off the old dermatology services. We've now got 2 sets of costs. Is the business case there? And then suddenly, oh no, the project money's finished. We don't do that anymore. We go back to the old way of having patients attend hospitals. So those
I think this is what,
that is the classic cycle that you need to get out of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this is something that the DIGA model, the NHS Digital Therapeutics Pathway model, the PECAN in France, and the Benelux mHealth model is trying to do that. There is a
trying really hard. Let's see.
Let's see. Okay, trying really. So, Siim, you have a hands up. Your hand up. So,
yeah,
your question.
Yeah. First of all, Kevin, thank you very much for a very clear and concise, coverage of the whole. It's a very complex topic. I think it's very relevant to all of our teams. And basically just continuing the same discussion, which kind of seems to be probably the most important topic for starting DTX companies. Coming back to the sort of the prevention discussion, that we could argue that actually the biggest business model shift that needs to happen in healthcare is a move from more reactive to a more preventive model, right?
Yeah.
And at the same time, as you mentioned, there is sort of this cost displacement dilemma of where the actual value of this preventative measures might become apparent, maybe in 20 years or something. So, and many of our companies actually have in some shape or form, a preventative element in their solution. So, what are these sort of practical ways that we can tackle this problem, when we talk to payers already today? So, for example, taking the cardiovascular example that you mentioned, lowering LDL cholesterol today might bring the downstream benefit in 10 years. So how do we, who's going to pay for that?
Well, in some ways that it's a very interesting example, because of course statins have been around now for 20, 25 years more. They're a commodity item. There are new statins coming along which have less side effects, etc. But it's actually an interesting one where lowering LDL and VLDL cholesterol is actually part of the business model now. So my argument would be, you have an open door there. What you also have budget, which is set aside as well, because there's already somewhere in somebody's ledger, in the health insurance company or in the government department or the payer, there is a column which says how much we spend on LDL and VLDL reduction. So you actually have a budget to go for. I would say that's quite an easy one. More difficult is if we say there are now things which need to be done in chemically or through drug therapeutics in the 30s and 40s to avoid dementia onset in the 70s, because that's a 40-year commitment. But actually, there are things which can be done, and prevention is actually a lot to do with something which is really, really difficult. And by the way, is a big red flag for investors: changing individuals' behavior. Unfortunately, there is a vicious circle amongst people who are interested in their health and have enough money to pay for private tuition, guidance, products, therapies, all of those things coming out, and those who avoid any action at all on their personal behalf to become healthier and actually can't afford to do things which they should be doing, etc., etc. It's an absolutely massive dilemma. The burden of healthcare is changing dramatically, and it will continue to change. And it's not just heart disease; it's cancer, it's mental illness as well. A lot is linked into this COVID-19. At one point, I heard, it's anecdotal evidence, but I heard that every single person on a respirator in one of our major hospitals here near where I live was metabolically compromised. So they had high visceral fat, high HbA1c, etc. Now that's a lifetime decision. It's a lifestyle decision. Yes, there are now drugs emerging, and they're probably in the news in Estonia as the same as they are. They're in the news today in the UK. Inject your way out of obesity, etc. And there are terrific drugs coming along to help with that, but they cost money. Prevention is much better. But I can tell you, other than miracle drugs, which there will always be a market for, anything which is around personal lifestyle changes aided by technology has a very limited market, because I'm afraid it's people like us who are interested already in their healthcare and have the funds and to buy a coaching course on diet, or a dietary coach, or and actually things like Peloton don't really help. We know that now. Exercise doesn't really, you can't exercise away a bad diet, but get somebody to change their diet, really difficult. So prevention, I would say, look for where there is already a hidden preventive budget and see if you can sequester some of that, see if you can get your hands on some of that budget. Creating new budgets around prevention, really difficult.
Or avoid the word prevention altogether.
Yeah, that's the P word. Just don't put it in there. But, you know,
In your pitch deck.
When you read pitch decks, you soon get to read between the lines. Pardon me. Any more questions?
Yes, there are two more from Katrina, and she asked, like, would you suggest to start from the most serious diagnosis groups, the most affected segments, in terms of like tackling this field? So, okay, let's say I want to start the digital therapeutics. Should I go to the kind of hot areas, mental health, cardiovascular, so on? Or
I see. Okay, I thought the question was about within, let's say within mental health. Let's go for the people who are paranoid schizophrenics or, you know, seriously exacerbated disease states. If you're talking about diseases themselves,
within, yes, exactly. So within the disease group. So
it's more complicated as usual. I should. There's a very good science writer here in the UK called Ben Goldacre, I think his name is, and he has a T-shirt made up which says it's more complicated than that. It is more complicated than that, I'm afraid. What you need to look at is the match between what you can do and a market which is ready to adopt. And one of the interesting things which I've been thinking about working on is clinical eligibility is a really important area. So is the patient clinically eligible for what I can do for them? But with digital, there's another overlay, which is, are they socially eligible as well? So if you get to a stage where your target market nowadays is probably the over 80s, then having a digital connection to them is really quite difficult. You know, even now, there are a lot of 80-year-olds and 80-plus-year-olds who are very proficient with the internet, but it's by no means the majority. If you are going for that group of people, you probably need to aim your service and look at the regulations and the regulatory issues, the data sharing issues, and target their children and their neighbors, because they're actually your customer group. So thinking subtly about who can help, why am I going to help, and then how do I get to them is really the trick. For instance, I started a company here in the UK with some friends 4 or 5 years ago, which targets elderly people in their own homes. We're not targeting them with medical interventions, though. We're targeting them with social care interventions. That helps us a lot because it's simpler on the regulatory side of things. And we also came in, one of the first things we launched was the family app. So that actually it's not the elderly person themselves who's the customer, it's their sons, daughters, neighbors, nephews, godchildren, whoever's interested in their care, and put that together as a proposition. And that gave us great traction as well. So I think unfortunately it's more complicated than that. Often the most extreme is not the right ones because they will be in and out of hospital all the time and they need urgent care, they need critical care, critical responses. The people who are least, who are mild symptoms, and I've been talking to several of the projects in Estonia about this, actually most of the time it's not affecting their lives. So a little bit of technology, they don't really adopt it because they don't think about the problem very often. It's the people who are in the middle who are kind of seriously affected but not critically affected, and their disease is part of their lives, and they have this social eligibility over the top. So they have a broadband connection, they have a Google phone or an iPhone, they know how to use an app, they know how to download an app. It might be very simple. When you get to a certain age, you get sarcopenia and your fingers stop having muscle in the end of them and you just can't use touchscreens anymore. So those kind of things, it's a very complex area, but the basic issue is segment to somewhere where you can get traction. That's what I'm looking for, is has this company got some traction somewhere? And then can I see where it will go to in adjacent uses?
Thank you. Maybe a quick answer. This is definitely a very quick answer. So is there a perfect track for UK market adoption? How to accelerate in the NHS your digital therapeutic?
Do you want to tell everybody what I told you? No. It's tough. It's really tough. There are tremendously good intentions, but in any organization that deals with 50 odd million people in, depending on how you segment it, 400 different organizations, it's a very fragmented market. But it does depend. If it's a specialty you're aiming for, and you can find a Royal College, a sponsor in a Royal College, or one of the, in cancer, you're in cancer care. If you go to the Royal Marsden, you can find a champion at the Royal Marsden Hospital in London. You're off to a good start. But it's a very complex market. Often my advice, and please don't everybody rush off to Edinburgh and say that Kevin Dean told you to give them a ring, but Scotland is a very good place to start with digital therapies, because they've had the problem of a remote workforces in the North Sea, of remote populations on Scottish islands. They've had a Scottish Centre for Telehealth for a long, long time, and I've put this at the heart of what they're doing. And their leadership is very good as well. I work quite closely with them from time to time. So, and Scotland's a market of, whatever it is, 2.5, 3 million people. It's just about the right size to get experience to go, and you can get all the decision makers around the table fairly quickly. The issue with England is you have some very big national organizations, but the local delivery isn't always as connected as it can be, to just because of sheer size and of complexity of organizations. But there are some good efforts to be made. It's just pick your battles and get a champion is my recommendation.
Thank you so much. So I think the time is up now. It has been very insightful, and all the 9 commandments everyone must take with them in their track to develop a digital therapeutic or any digital health product in this highly complex sphere.
Yeah, sure. As I say, perhaps the best thing I can do to summarize all of this, there is a short paper I wrote. I think you've had it early in our interaction. There's a short paper I wrote and published with permission after the patient at home program, which is those kind of 8 or 9 learnings. If you or Sim want to drop me a line, I'll send a PDF copy and you can distribute that to people on the call.
Great. I will do that. Yes, I will check if you have it already, or I will just ask for this, and we can share it with them.
Yeah, I'll send you, if you prompt me, I'll send you a version that's shareable.
Great, thank you.
Good.
Okay, then that's about it. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone who are listening or will listen. And yes, let's build up this complex, long-term, big changes. At least the foundation for it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin.
Hope it helped. Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye-bye.